Part 1. The Outlaw's Confession. Dark and intimate, on the eve of his hanging, when the town had gone quiet and even the saloon lamps were dimmed as if ashamed to shine, Silas Crow sat alone beneath the gallows with his hands free for the first time in years, the sheriff having granted him one last night without chains, believing no man so close to death would try to outrun it, and the wind moved slowly through the wooden beams above him, making them sigh and creak like old men remembering too much, and it was in that lonely hour, with the moon pale and distant, that Silas began to speak, not to the guards who stood far off pretending not to listen, and not to God, whom he had avoided most of his life, but to the night itself, because the night had always known him best, and his voice was low and rough, worn down by dust and regret, as he confessed the truth no one had ever asked for, the truth buried beneath years of gun smoke and bad songs, the truth that the legend had it wrong from the very start, because Silas Crow, the feared outlaw, the man blamed for blood and fire across 3 counties, had never wanted the life that claimed him, and he said it slowly, like each word had weight, like if he rushed it the wind might steal it away, explaining how it began with a boy named Samuel, long before the name Silas Crow ever frightened a soul, back when his hands shook not from violence but from hope, when he believed land could be earned and kindness returned, when he followed his father west chasing a promise that dried up faster than the riverbeds, and how the first lie told about him came the day a ranch burned not by his hand but by lightning, though a dead man's rifle was found nearby and his name was easier to curse than the storm, and from there the lie grew, fed by fear and hunger, until men hunted him for a crime that was never his, and each time he ran further from the boy he had been, further into the shape the world demanded he become, and Silas admitted, his voice tightening, that he had learned to wear that shape because it kept him alive, because when men expect a monster they see one even in shadow, and so he let the legend grow, let the whispers sharpen, let the wanted posters turn his face into something cruel, because the truth would have required someone to listen, and listening was rare in those days, and then he spoke of the secret itself, the one thing no court record held, the one choice that stained him deeper than any crime he was accused of, the night he walked away from a woman named Eleanor Finch, whose name he spoke as if it might break, a woman who had seen him clearly before the world taught her not to, a woman who believed the lie could still be undone, who begged him to stay and fight for his name, and he confessed that he did not leave to protect her as the legend would later claim, but because he was afraid that if he stayed and failed she would see him the way everyone else did, afraid that the boy Samuel was already gone, and that staying would prove it, so he chose the road, the easier cruelty of distance, and in doing so sealed the fate that followed him ever since, and the wind seemed to lean closer as he spoke of how every robbery pinned to his name paid for by someone else's desperation, how every gunshot echoed louder in his own chest than in the canyons, how each death he witnessed, even those not by his hand, added weight to a soul already bent, and still he carried on because stopping would mean standing still with his regrets, and now, with the gallows above him and dawn waiting like a quiet judge, he finally admitted the truth that rewrote the story entirely, that the worst thing Silas Crow ever did was not the violence men sang about but the love he abandoned, the life he refused to defend, and as he spoke the night seemed to hold its breath, because this confession was not a plea for mercy or a claim of innocence, but an offering, a final attempt to set something right even if no one believed him, even if the wind was the only witness, and he ended not with anger but with a tired calm, saying that legends were built by men who never asked why, and that the Wild West was not soaked in blood so much as in silence, and when his voice finally faded, the gallows stood still, the moon slid behind a cloud, and somewhere in the dark, truth long buried waited to see if it would die with him or finally be heard. When the widow arrived in Red Mesa, she came without announcement, riding a tired gray horse beneath a sky bleached white by the sun, her black dress dusty at the hem and her face half hidden by a veil not meant for mourning so much as distance, and the town noticed her at once because Red Mesa noticed everything new, especially things that felt like trouble, and her name, Lydia Hale, passed from mouth to mouth in low voices before she had even dismounted, spoken with the weight of old stories that clung to it like burrs, stories that said every outlaw she had ever loved met a violent end, some by rope, some by bullet, some disappearing into the desert as if the land itself had claimed them, and though no one could agree on how many men there had been or whether she had truly loved them at all, they all agreed on one thing, that death followed her like a shadow that lengthened at sundown, and so the men of Red Mesa kept their distance, tipping hats politely but never lingering, watching her from porches and saloon doors as she purchased a small adobe house at the edge of town where the desert began to swallow fences and the wind sang through dry brush at night, And Lydia did not protest the whispers because she had learned long ago that denying a legend only sharpened it, and besides, grief had taught her that silence was often the only armor left, for she had buried enough men to understand how easily love turned into something sharp, and each morning she rose before the heat, tending a small garden that fought bravely against the sand, her movement steady, her eyes thoughtful, as if she were always listening for something she did not expect to hear again. And weeks passed like this, Red Mesa holding its breath, until one late afternoon when the sun hung low and red and the air felt heavy with coming night, Lydia heard a sound at her door that did not belong to the wind, a dull thud followed by a breath dragged painfully through dust, and when she opened the door she found a man collapsed against the frame, blood darkening his shirt near the shoulder, his revolver fallen from slack fingers, his face pale beneath a week's worth of travel and fear, and for a moment she simply looked at him, because she recognized the shape of this moment too well. The way fate had a habit of knocking when one least wanted an answer, and the man looked up at her with unfocused eyes and whispered her name, not because he knew her, but because he had heard the stories and believed them even as the ground rose to meet him. And Lydia did not ask who he was or why he was wounded, because questions could wait and life could not, so she dragged him inside with a strength born not of muscle but of necessity, laying him on the narrow bed, cleaning the wound with practiced hands, her jaw set against memories she did not invite but could not stop. And as the night deepened she worked by lamplight, stitching skin, pressing cloth, listening to his fevered murmurs that spoke of betrayal, of men who rode faster than promises, and when he finally slept she sat beside him, watching his chest rise and fall, telling herself she was only doing what any decent soul would do, that this meant nothing more than survival, yet even then she felt the old ache stirring, the one she had sworn never to feed again, and the town noticed the next morning when the widow did not appear at market, when her shutters stayed closed, when rumors grew like weeds watered by curiosity, and inside the house the wounded gunslinger woke to pain and confusion. His name revealed slowly as Thomas Reed, a man known on wanted posters but tired of living up to them, a man who had run from one bad choice into another until running was all he knew, and when Lydia brought him water he studied her face as if searching for proof of the curse he had been warned about, and she met his gaze without flinching, telling him plainly that he would heal if he rested and that he would leave when he could walk, nothing more promised and nothing less, and over the days that followed the desert burned outside while something quieter grew between them, built not on bold declarations but on small moments, on shared silence at dusk, on the way he watched her tend the garden with hands that once only knew weapons, on the way she listened without judgment when he spoke of roads that led nowhere and choices that closed more doors than they opened. And though neither spoke of love, it moved between them like heat trapped under skin, dangerous because it was unspoken, because both knew too well how such stories ended, and Lydia felt the old fear return, not of death itself but of hope, because hope had always been the cruelest thing, arriving just in time to be taken, and Thomas felt it too, the pull of a life that might be different, the temptation to believe he could stay, even as the town's eyes followed him whenever he stepped outside, even as whispers sharpened again, warning that he would be next, that Red Mesa would soon add another name to the widow's legend, and one evening, as the sun bled out across the sand, Thomas asked her the question everyone else feared to, asking if the stories were true, and Lydia did not deny them, nor did she explain them away. She only said that loving men who lived by the gun was like loving the storm, that you never truly knew when it would turn, and that sometimes survival meant choosing solitude, and Thomas understood more than he wished to, because he saw himself clearly in her words, saw the danger he carried like a second shadow, and still, when he stood close to her in the fading light, neither stepped away, and the desert wind moved through the sagebrush as if whispering a warning learned long ago, and in that moment fate tightened its thread, weaving something beautiful and fragile beneath the burning western sun, something that could not last unchanged, because love in such a place never did, and as night fell over Red Mesa, the widow and the gunslinger stood at the edge of a story neither had meant to enter again, knowing that whatever came next would cost them something, whether they chose to stay or finally walk away. Deadwood Crossing had forgotten what law looked like long before the broken Marshall rode in. The town stretched thin and tired beneath a sky the color of old iron, its main street lined with buildings that leaned as if they had grown weary of standing, and when the man finally appeared at the far end of the road, dust-covered and hunched in the saddle, no one rushed to greet him because Deadwood Crossing had learned that hope was an expensive habit, and the man himself did not look like hope at all, his coat patched and faded, his horse limping slightly, his shoulders carrying a weight heavier than the worn badge pinned to his chest, a badge he had sworn never to wear again, and his name was Jonah Mercer, though few would have recognized it now, because years ago it had been spoken with respect in places that still believed in order, before a single failure stripped it of shine and left him wandering from town to town, carrying the memory of a night that refused to loosen its grip. And as Jonah dismounted, slowly, favoring an old injury that never healed right, he felt the eyes on him, suspicious and sharp, because Deadwood Crossing belonged to men who answered to no law and feared no consequence, men who had turned the absence of order into a kind of freedom. And the first thing Jonah noticed was the silence, not peaceful but tense, like a held breath, broken only by the creak of a loose sign and the distant sound of laughter spilling from the saloon, laughter that carried too easily, as if nothing truly mattered anymore. And Jonah stood there for a moment, dust settling around his boots, remembering the last town that had looked at him that way, the last time he had believed he could make a difference, and how it had ended in fire and graves and a badge soaked in regret. And he might have turned back then, might have ridden on as he had so many times before, but something in Deadwood Crossing felt like a question he could not ignore, and so he walked forward, step by careful step, into a town that did not want saving and a future that did not want him. And inside the saloon the music faltered when he entered, conversations dropping into murmurs as men took in the sight of him, the badge catching the light like an accusation. And Jonah met their stares without challenge, ordering water instead of whiskey, because he had learned the hard way how quickly liquor loosened judgment. And as he drank he heard the whispers, questions traded like cards, wondering if he was brave or foolish or simply desperate. And when a man near the bar laughed and said there hadn't been a marshal in Deadwood Crossing for 5 years, Jonah answered quietly that he wasn't there to stay, only to pass through, though even as he said it he felt the lie settle uncomfortably in his chest, because he knew he had already stayed too long. And word reached him quickly, as it always did, of who truly ruled the town, a man named Calder Rusk, whose power came not from a title but from fear, whose men filled the streets at night and whose justice was delivered without witnesses. And Jonah listened, nodding, storing each detail away like kindling, because he recognized the pattern all too well, the way rot spread when left alone. And as night fell he took a room above the livery, lying awake as memories crept in uninvited, memories of another crossing, another town, where he had been younger and stronger and convinced that doing the right thing was enough, remembering the night he failed to protect a family caught between outlaw revenge and slow law, remembering the sound of a gunshot he had been too late to stop, the look in his wife's eyes when she realized the badge he wore could not shield them from everything, and remembering the morning he buried them both beneath a sky just as indifferent as this one. And it was that memory that had driven him away from the law, had convinced him that wearing the badge only invited loss. And now, staring at the ceiling as Deadwood Crossing slept uneasily below, Jonah wondered what cruel hand had brought him here, to a place that mirrored his past so closely it felt like a dare. And dawn came hard and bright, revealing a town bracing itself not for peace but for violence, because Calder Rusk had heard about the marshal and took offense at the implication, sending men to test him, small confrontations meant to measure resolve. And Jonah answered each one with restraint, stepping between a beaten shopkeeper and a laughing thug, standing his ground without drawing his gun, reminding himself that law was not meant to be loud. And the townspeople watched with guarded interest, unused to someone who did not look away. And with each passing hour the tension tightened, because Rusk would not allow a badge to exist without challenge. And Jonah knew it, knew the war was already forming like a storm on the horizon, and still he stayed, because running would have meant confirming every doubt he carried about himself. And when the marshal and the outlaw leader finally met, it was not in a blaze of gunfire but in the open street, beneath the sun that showed everything clearly. And Rusk smiled as if amused, mocking Jonah's limp, his age, his tired eyes, telling him Deadwood Crossing did not need saving. And Jonah listened, hearing echoes of men he had faced before, men who believed fear was strength, and when he spoke it was not with anger but with certainty, saying the town deserved better even if it did not ask for it. And that was when the lines were drawn, not by weapons but by choice, and the townspeople felt it, that shift where neutrality became impossible. And as days passed Deadwood Crossing prepared for war in quiet ways, doors reinforced, families hiding valuables, men choosing sides whether they admitted it or not. And Jonah trained those willing to learn, not to fight recklessly but to stand together, teaching them that courage was not the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it. And each night he sat alone, cleaning his gun, talking softly to ghosts who never answered, asking them if this time would be different, if redemption was something earned or simply endured. And on the eve of the confrontation, as the wind swept through the crossing carrying dust and tension alike, Jonah stood in the street and looked at the town he had come to care for despite himself, realizing that win or lose, he had already reclaimed something he thought was gone forever, the belief that his life could still matter to someone beyond his own regrets. And when the first shot finally rang out the next morning, sharp and final as a closing door, Jonah did not hesitate, stepping forward, with the badge catching the light once more, not because he believed he could erase the past, but because he understood at last that facing it was the only way to live with it. And as Deadwood Crossing erupted into chaos and courage, the last marshal stood firm, ready to pay whatever price was asked, knowing that even if this town took everything he had left, he would no longer run from the man he had once been, or the law he had never truly stopped believing in. Deep in Black Canyon, where the sun seemed to burn hotter and shadows clung longer than they should, there was said to be a hidden vein of gold cursed by the devil himself, and most folks dismissed it as another frontier tale meant to scare children and soften grown men into staying close to town. But legends have a way of surviving because someone, somewhere, once believed them deeply enough to suffer for it, and that someone, this time, was a desperate prospector named Matthew Klein, a quiet man with hollow cheeks and eyes worn thin by failure, who found the map not by design but by accident while dismantling the rotting floorboards of a miner's shack abandoned so long even the wind had forgotten it, and the map was drawn in faded ink on brittle paper, marked with symbols that looked less like directions and more like warnings, though Matthew, hungry and half-mad with need, chose to see only what he wanted. The promise of gold enough to buy back the life that had slipped through his fingers, and the first whisper came that night as he studied the map by firelight, soft as breath and nearly mistaken for wind, calling his name though no one alive knew him well enough to speak it that way, and he told himself it was loneliness playing tricks, because the desert had a habit of making men hear things when silence grew too wide. Yet as he followed the map into Black Canyon days later, the whispers followed too, growing clearer with each mile, speaking not in threats but in gentle encouragements, reminding him of debts unpaid, of faces disappointed, of all the times he had almost been someone worth remembering. And Matthew walked faster then, driven by something that felt like hope twisted into hunger, the canyon walls rising around him like the ribs of some ancient beast, the air cooler yet heavier, as if the land itself were watching. And at night the whispers gathered near his camp, circling just beyond the firelight, never stepping close enough to be seen, promising that the gold was real, that it was waiting, that all he had to do was keep going and listen. And he did listen, because the voices knew things no stranger should, knew about his brother buried in a borrowed grave, about the woman who stopped writing when his letters grew too thin with apologies, and each truth pulled him deeper until he no longer noticed how the canyon seemed to shift, how paths twisted back on themselves, how his shadow sometimes moved a half-second slower than it should. And when he finally found the vein, gleaming darkly in the rock like a wound that refused to heal, Matthew wept, laughing and crying at once as his hands shook against the stone, and the whispers fell silent for the first time, replaced by a stillness so complete it pressed against his ears. And in that silence he felt the cost before he understood it, because as he chipped away at the gold the canyon answered with memories not his own, visions of men who had come before, their faces gaunt, their eyes bright with the same terrible hope, each one offering something they loved in exchange for riches they never lived long enough to enjoy. And Matthew realized then that the curse was not a single price demanded all at once, but a slow taking, a bargain that began with attention and ended with identity. And as he filled his satchel the whispers returned, no longer gentle, urging him to hurry, to take more, to leave nothing behind, because enough was never enough once the canyon had its hold. And when he finally turned to leave, weighed down by gold and dread alike, the path he had come by was gone, replaced by narrow passages that closed behind him, the walls seeming to breathe, and the voices told him the truth at last, that the devil's gold was not cursed because it killed men, but because it convinced them they were already dead without it. And Matthew staggered through the maze, growing weaker as the